We're going to take a deep dive into how energy affects the economy. We're going to look at the reality of green energy, and we're going to see how you can actually profit from the energy marketplace. So unless you've been living on a deserted island where you haven't had to fill up your automobile or you haven't had access to any news media, you probably know that gas costs a lot more than it did the past couple of years. And energy in general is getting to be awfully expensive around the world. So what we're going to do today is, just kind of dig in a little bit and talk about energy. This isn't going to be an enormous deep dive. It's more of a back of the napkin approach. I just wanted to kind of show, where we're headed with energy and what we need to be thinking about for the future. And of course, because it's a financial podcast and video, we'll talk a little bit about what could you do to maybe profit from the future of energy. So right now, what you have is kind of two competing parties in the world of energy. The first party is folks who absolutely want green energy. And they want to get rid of carbon emissions completely. And they're going to do it through solar and wind. That's the way to do it. That's the future. Don't discuss anything differently. And right now, a lot of our governmental policies are kind of driving that way. You see a lot of benefits to looking to go solar, to do geothermal, to do wind. And you're starting to see that they're restricting quite a bit the ability of the traditional carbon-based energy sources of expanding with new exploration and credits, things along those lines. So we've got that group that's very active, but we also have the other group that consistently just wants cheap energy to ensure that the economy can function and reach its maximum potential. They don't care if it's coal, they don't care if it's nuclear, they don't care solar. They're agnostic on what kind of energy source, just that there's plenty of energy and the energy is cheap. So what is the future? And how can these two parties kind of come together to make sure that everything works? Now, regarding the latter group there, they're probably certainly onto something. You absolutely have to have cheap energy sources in order to have a really good economy. Okay, in order for Americans to maintain their standard of living the way we have it, energy, accessible energy, cheap energy is critical. And I always like to use the British Empire as sort of the example of how we as humans have migrated to different energy sources in order to help improve our lives. So, really for eons in England, basically the fuel source was biofuels or biomass. Essentially, it was wood. Now, they might use a little cow dung, which, we probably shudder at the fact that they could have thrown some, hardened cow manure into a stove to stay warm, but they did. They understood it created energy. But anyway, it was basically wood. And what happened was, as they started to move into kind of the 1600s, wood was becoming a little harder to come by due to population increases. The forest was being reduced in Britain. So you had a situation where wood was being used not only as a fuel source, but you had to have wood in order to build. So with a growing population, it got to the point it was very difficult to maintain the economy using wood. It got to be very expensive. They started to see long periods of inflation because they had trouble getting enough access to wood. Well, then the Brits discovered that they could use this little black rock for fuel? Coal. And what they found was coal was a lot more energy dense than the wood. And then it also allowed that any future trees and forests were able to be used for building and not energy as much. So by going to the fuel, the new fuel, coal, the British Empire saw a huge boom. All of a sudden, inflation came way down. The ability to expand their empire went up considerably. And the wonderful thing is the government didn't step in any way to try to stop that transition. So you basically had a perfect transition to a new energy source that expanded the economic capability of the British Empire. And then as we moved into the early 1900s, the British Navy actually was the first to make the switch to oil. And what that did is by moving to an even more energy dense fuel source than coal, it allowed the British Empire and specifically the Navy to expand rapidly, which resulted in the British Empire that we pretty much know now. So by switching to different fuel sources, by moving to more energy dense sources, you could see that it allowed the British Empire to grow into what at one point we knew it was in the early 1900s. So we do have to have, for an economy to function properly, we've got to have cheap energy. And this shows you basically cheaper energy means a larger gross domestic product, which is what we use to measure the size of the economy. And you can tell the US and China are the largest users of oil right now, which is our predominant energy source, which means we also have the largest economies. Remember, the US is about 5% of the world's population, but yet we're about 25% of the world's GDP, or economic output. And the biggest reason for that is our access to cheap energy. And you don't think all these wars in the Middle East were done because we just really had some political motives behind it. No, it was for energy. Everybody knows that. So the fact that we had a cheap, abundant energy source has allowed our economy to grow to the size that it is, despite the fact that we're only 5% of the population. Now, granted, we also have a little bit more of a free market economy, which always produces more economic output. We have a legal system that basically creates fair rules so that you know that you can function without having despots or dictators come in and take what you own or destroy your business model in any way. But the biggest thing that you can see here, more energy equals larger GDP. So let's just take a quick look at global energy consumption by source. So this graph kind of goes all the way back to 1800 and shows you how much energy was being used in the world from 1800 all the way through, this goes through 2019. So you can kind of see from this, the demand for energy around the world as the population's grown has grown with it. It's been enormous. And it's going to continue to be enormous, even if the population starts to fade off. Everything that we do now requires energy to function. Technology is a huge consumption of energy. So it's very important that we have enough cheap available energy, again, to maintain our standard of living. So this gives you all the different kinds of traditional energy sources and how much is being used today. Now let's break this down a little bit further and really get into it. So the first one is just traditional biomass. What does that mean? Well, basically wood, lumber, that's what we're talking about here. Again, there's some other natural things that we use for fuel. I mentioned dung already as one, but for the most part, we're talking lumber here. And it's really been a pretty much consistent amount of biomass that's been used going back to the 1800s. It hasn't gone up like some of the other energy sources that we have, but it's still used a lot more than you probably would think, especially in third world countries, emerging market economies. They're still using a lot of wood and natural biomass. So next, let's jump into coal. Now, I know coal, I know a lot of the folks, the green folks right now are probably, acting a little bit like this when they see that I put coal up there. It's the most hated, but you can see that the use of coal continues to expand, even today. So coal is still an enormous part of our energy infrastructure. And right now, the world uses, it's about 8.5 billion tons of coal each year. And the U.S. in particular, we still use about 20%, 20 to 22% of our energy comes from burning coal. Now that's down significantly here in the U.S. I mean, at one point we were closer to 50% decades ago, but now it's still a pretty hefty, 20 to 22%. And now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, we still have about 100 years worth of coal reserves based on today's consumption. So that's clearly a projection. There could be a lot more than that. There could actually be less than that. We might find new sources for it. But kind of based on current geological surveys and understandings and science, we've got about 100 years worth of coal left. So 100 years to you and me seems like a lot. Probably neither one of us are going to be here. I know I won't be here 100 years from now. But 100 years in the terms of human history is a pretty small number. So it's definitely something you can see there is a finite amount of coal that's here. So if we're going to have cheap, abundant energy so that our economy and standard of living can continue, clearly coal is not something that's going to be here forever. So next, after coal, let's jump into the other dirty oil that I know folks who are real green really hate. It's oil. And as you can see here from the early 1900s on, the amount of oil that we've been using around the world for energy has only gone up. And it's still at pretty much an all-time peak right here. In fact, right now, the world basically consumes about 35 billion barrels of oil per year, which amounts to roughly 97 to 100 million barrels per day. And again, based on our current geological sciences, we estimate we have 47 to 50 years left of oil. Again, we may make it, I don't know if I'll make it 50 years, but you might be a younger person and 47 years from now is going to come awfully quick for you. And in the grand scheme of humanity, 47 years, it's a rounding error. So again, there may be a lot more oil out there than what we project right now, but you can see that it's clearly not going to last forever. So next we'll jump to natural gas. Natural gas making up a larger and larger part of our energy infrastructure around the world. Right now, we use about 132 million cubic feet of gas each year. And the current estimates, again, sort of assume that we have between 40 and 52 years left of natural gas. So here again, a very abundant source right now, but if our science of today is anywhere near close, it's definitely not going to last forever. Next, we'll just take a look at nuclear. You can see nuclear, we're talking like here in the U.S., it makes up 6 to 8% of our energy source. Around the world, it's probably more like 4%. But again, a very valuable energy source. Same with hydropower. Here in the U.S., we're about 3% hydropower. But you can start to see, as I go through each energy source, the cleaner energy sources make up a very small amount of our total energy right now. Now we'll jump to wind. And wind is almost difficult, if not impossible, to see on this graph. And then we'll go to solar, which is even harder to see. So for the folks out there that say we should only be wind and solar and we need to do it right now and we need to replace oil, you're just living in la la land. You're completely detached from reality. Anybody with a first grade education or more, just who sees how much that we're using in coal, oil, and natural gas, and then how much we're producing from solar and wind right now, there's just no way that you can replace it that quickly. In order for us to get to as much coal and oil and natural gas that we're using today, it took decades. At least 50 years of growth in those energy sources. And let's take just sort of a look. This is a couple years old, but it's hard to find absolutely up to the minute data on this. But this is energy consumption here in the United States over time from 2000 to 2018. And you can see our use of coal has dropped considerably, about 8% over that period, whereas our use of natural gas has jumped about 6%. Petroleum's held pretty steady throughout. We still use about the same amount of petroleum, still use about the same nuclear and hydroelectric. We use a little bit less wind than we did 20 years ago. But we have started to see wind and solar make an impact, or make an appearance, I guess I should say. But it's still, we're talking about 1% for solar and 1% for wind right now. So in order for it to get to the point where it's replacing those bottom three, that makes up 70% of our energy infrastructure here in the U.S., it's just not going to happen in the very near term. So again, we're trying to focus on finding abundant energy to make sure we keep our standard of living. That's one of the big goals. And looking at energy, or oil specifically, you can see we kind of, here in the United States, we hit peak oil back in 1970 based on a normal production, normal oil production, for lack of a better word, I guess. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll see the last few years we've had an increase, but this has been more the shale oil. So we have found the ability to increase the amount of oil that we produce as a country through shale, but from the more traditional, the traditional drilling, traditional oil, the crude oil, we hit the peak way back in 1970. And the thing that you have to remember is the amount of money it takes now to get the energy out, it's costing a lot more. So way back in 1930, and again, we're looking at oil here, but back in 1930, for every dollar that we spent to get energy, we got $100 worth out. So it's pretty easy. You go back to one of my all-time favorite movies, There Will Be Blood. But once they got the drill into the ground, it would start spraying. The cost to get that in there was very minimal. The oil was very close to the top, so it didn't have to go far to get to the oil. So it was basically, you made $100 for every dollar you spent. And it's been dropping steadily since then. So by 1970, it was still a pretty good ratio. For every dollar you spent, you got $25 out. By 2000, it was, only 10 to 1. Today, it's about $3.50 out for every dollar that we spend. And if you look at this oil shale, it's really 2 to 1. So yeah, we may have a lot of oil shale out there, but the problem is that we get to the point where we're relying strictly on that, we no longer have a cheap energy source. It's costing us 50% of our profit margin just to get the oil out of the ground. Now, certainly human ingenuity is going to make this cheaper, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you could just drop a drill 30 feet below the ground, and all of a sudden you got oil spraying out, as opposed to having to go 200-300 feet, 400 feet down, carving through really dense rock to get to it. It's just harder to get the energy there. And the more it costs to get the energy out, the more it's going to cost to use the energy, meaning less economic output. And it's the same for coal. Over time, what they're projecting here over the next 25 years is the price to get more coal out of the ground is going to easily double. So we're looking at maybe the end of cheap energy if we're focused on our gas, coal, and oil. And so that group of people that want a cheap energy source to make sure that we're keeping our standard of living and growing the economy, we've got to think. We've got to think for other sources. And are those other sources solar and wind? Is it really feasible? Now, I've already said you can't do it in the very short term, but is it even feasible for the long term? And, right now, based on today's technology and the way it's structured, the solar panels, the only light from the sun, there's different wavelengths from every sunbeam that's shot down to us. The wavelengths that we can use to turn it into actual energy is only about a third of the light. So a third of the sunshine that hits us can be used to process to turn into energy. Right now, the best we do with it is about 26%. So as I've mentioned before, human ingenuity, things like that, we'll probably get to the point where maybe we can get it up to that 33%. The other thing we might be able to do is figure out a way to have some smaller wavelengths possibly produce some of the energy, turn it into electricity. But right now, it's not very efficient. Now, for wind power, the maximum amount of time that we have that we can produce energy is about 60% of the time. So 40% of the time, you just don't have enough wind to be able to generate any kind of energy from wind. Right now, based on our technology, we're only at about 45%. So less than half the time, wind is producing energy that can be used. So a lot of people argue, well, okay, so it's inefficient, but if we build enough solar farms and solar panels, and if we have enough wind farms, we can just store it with batteries. Well, that's not really very feasible either. If you took Tesla's battery plant, which is probably the largest one here in the United States, it would take them up to about 500 years to produce enough batteries to store 1 day's worth of electricity here in the United States. Not very feasible. So a lot of people that argue that, well, okay, yeah, we know that the sun doesn't shine all the time and that the wavelengths don't produce, we can't use all of the wavelengths from the sun in order to create energy. And same with, wind, we only get, 45% of the time that we're really getting energy from wind, but we can store it in batteries. Well, not really. I mean, it's something that's going to be awfully difficult to do, if not impossible. And the other thing too is, we're completely ignoring the cost to build these batteries, to utilize them, and then to dispose of them when their shelf life is done. So, the big thing that a lot of people don't realize is it takes a lot of coal to make a solar panel. In fact, it's about 3,000 pounds of coal.
Because we're a little worried. Are we desperate to accept any idea that sounds alternative or green? Are we avoiding looking too closely because we don't want to know the answer? Ozzie Zenner, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and Northwestern University, was asking some of the same questions.
I mean, I thought that solar and wind were probably very good solutions. I mean, it wasn't really even that long ago.
One of the most dangerous things right now is the illusion that alternative technologies like wind and solar are somehow different from fossil fuels. Well, I hear a lot of times that solar cells are made out of sand.
Have you ever thought about solar panels? The main ingredient that makes them work is silicon or sand.
This is the raw material chips are made of, sand.
They don't use sand at all. So they use, I'll show you what they... So this is one of the ingredients. It's actually mined quartz.
Spruce Pine, North Carolina, regarded as the finest source of high-purity quartz in the world for semiconductor, solar, and communication applications.
But you can't use sand because sand has too many impurities. So you start with a very high-quality quartz and a very high-quality coal. And then you put those two together into an arc furnace and you melt them.
The quartz is then melted with coal in a large furnace at temperatures of up to 1,800 degrees.
So you need more coal to do that. So I'll get another coal out. So when we melt these together, we get silicon metal and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide just goes off and you got rid of the carbon, you're left with silicon metal. This is not clean coal.
Not clean coal. Ozzie Zenner said it was an illusion that renewables were replacing coal or any fossil fuel. Environmental groups continued telling a different story.
Now, there's two ways you can make solar panels. One is the traditional way with quartz and coal. But the other way is with silicon. Now, silicon's a lot cheaper, and it is an abundant source right now, so there's some potential there. But you can still see this is a silicon mine. To build these around the world and to do it in the quantity that we need, if we were going to really replace coal or oil or gas, it's a massive undertaking. And the other thing, as United States citizens, we have to think about is who's the biggest producers of of silicon. And you can see it's not our friendly neighbors here. We're talking China and Russia. So our two biggest adversaries have the most control over the silicon production. So even if we were going to try to make the move to solar, well, any kind of international conflict could disrupt that substantially and leave us without an energy source. The other thing to think about is how much does it really take as far as building materials to create all of these solar panels, hydroelectric plants, wind turbines, geothermal plants, and nuclear. And you can see just in the construction of the solar, it takes 17 times more materials than it would just a nuclear facility. So, a lot of times when you hear things out there from the green folks, they only want to focus on energy production once the solar or wind is in place. And the cost and, per kilowatt, what do we get out of it? And they say it's the cheapest once, but they only look at once it's built. They don't look at everything that has the input into it. What's the cost to get it built and transported? And then finally, what's the cost to dispose of it? The typical solar panel the older ones have about 11-year shelf life. The newer ones are between 20 and 25 years, much better. But still, once they're done, we have to send them, what we do right now is we send them to third world countries to be disposed of, which creates a lot of chemicals coming out of it, creates a lot of waste. And again, the vast majority of the older solar panels were made with coal. The newer ones are more silicon-based. Wind construction, if you're going to build a wind farm that could power 75,000 homes, it takes a lot of materials to get there. 30,000 tons of iron ore, 50,000 tons of concrete, and 900 tons of plastic. So again, you've got to factor everything in if you're really looking at, is it that efficient of a fuel source? So where this is all kind of heading for me, I talked about at the beginning, we want to find what's our energy future. And as an investor, how could you invest in it? So we might as well jump right into it. I think that probably nuclear is the way to go. It satisfies the folks who want clean energy, that don't want carbon emissions. And it also, as I'll show you, can satisfy the folks that want cheap energy, that want to make sure that we can continue to function as an economy, maintain our standard of living. Because the energy density of uranium is phenomenal. As I said at the outset, we have moved to more energy dense fuel sources from the start, all the way back from wood to coal to oil to natural gas, and now uranium's probably the next biggest step. This shows you, one uranium fuel pellet can produce 17,000, it's the same as 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 149 barrels of oil, and 1 ton of coal. That's pretty powerful stuff. And to put it in another way to think about it, how long would 1 pound of fuel power a light bulb? So 1 pound of coal would power a light bulb for 2 days. 1 pound of natural gas would power the light bulb for 3 days. If you used our old style of nuclear reactors, the uranium would still power a light bulb for 64 years. But if you now use our new methods of nuclear power, it could power a light bulb for 1,910 years. So you can see there's some serious energy density with nuclear. And even if you look at our current output of energy right here in the United States so far, the amount of money that we've spent on nuclear from its start in the 60s, we've spent about $1.8 trillion on nuclear energy. And right now it produces, between 6 to 8% of our total power grid. Whereas so far we've spent $2 trillion in solar and wind, and it's only producing about 3% of our energy total. So not only is nuclear cheaper, we're actually getting more bang for our buck out of it. And the thing is, you look at the capacity factor for nuclear, and it is by far the best. It's always on. Whereas with wind and solar, like we mentioned before, you're talking at best maybe 45% of capacity. So that's all we're getting out of it. It's not very available relative to, say, nuclear or geothermal. Nuclear, it's essentially up 93% of the time. So it's just a much better energy source for consistency as well. Because right now, when they're not producing enough energy from wind and solar, when those things are not getting the sunshine or the wind, we're basically keeping the power plants going with coal. And the biggest thing that I think that the green folks right now always point to, and the reason they don't want nuclear, is they feel it's unsafe. And that's just pretty ridiculous. I'm not going to get too deep in here, but there's really been one death directly related to the uranium exposure from nuclear energy. Now, there were some other deaths when, Chernobyl blew up, but that was more from the explosion and not from exposure to uranium. So you really have more deaths from coal miners than you have ever had from nuclear power plants. And if you actually factor in deaths associated with air pollution, well, clearly nuclear is the best way to go because there are none. So nuclear is actually unbelievably safe. But the problem, here in the United States, we're actually starting to see the nuclear capability go down. We're not adding to nuclear capacity. We're taking it away. And this chart basically kind of shows you the amount of wattage that we're getting from nuclear has been declining since 2008. And again, we jump back to the safety. The other big thing, people are so afraid of the storage of nuclear waste. But really, by the time we get down 40 years after the uranium's been used, the radioactivity falls radically. I mean, it really doesn't maintain the point where it's going to be such a threat to people. And honestly, we don't do this in the United States, but France recycles most of their uranium. So if you do a good job of recycling, you're limiting the exposure that somebody might face from a radioactive fallout. So let's just take a quick little example and look at a couple different countries, France and Germany. So France made a move to nuclear, cleaner energy, and they've reduced their exposure to coal and natural gas and oil, whereas Germany did not. Germany decided to focus more on the natural gas part and stick with oil. And the amount that they've tried to put into clean energy has been strictly solar and wind power. Now, they do have some nuclear there. I'm not saying that they don't have any, but as far as recent expenditures, they spent about $580 billion over the past decade or so, and it's mostly gone to solar and wind and not to nuclear. So Germany still derives more than half of its energy from sources that emit CO2. The other big difference between Germany and France is Germany's paying essentially twice the price that France is for their energy. And this is before the whole Russia-Ukraine issue. This data, you can see here, this was a 2015 stat. And this chart showing 2018, that basically from 06 to 2018, German electricity rates have risen 51%. So they're paying a lot more for their electricity because they're getting it from sources that aren't completely renewable. So as I mentioned before, they spent $580 billion on renewables, but if they'd have taken that money and just put it strictly on nuclear, Germany right now would be in a situation where it provides 100% of its energy needs with no reliance whatsoever on Russia. And like I said, I used some charts here that didn't focus on Russia, the whole Ukraine effect. But if you're paying attention at all, you got to know that the cost of energy in Germany has absolutely skyrocketed. And this is going to start to hit not just the people in Germany with their utility bills and worrying about staying warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It's going to start to affect the whole manufacturing world. There's a really good article out by a firm called Doomberg. They've got a subscription service, but they did a really good piece on how BASF, which is one of the largest chemical producers in the world, how they're going to have to shut down their production because the cost of natural gas has gone up so much it's no longer profitable to produce chemicals. And they're probably the largest producer of ammonia. And if you want to know how important ammonia is to the economy, just do a little bit of research. Just do a few Google searches and you'll see. So the way the chemical plants work, it's not like auto plants where you might have them all over a region. They build very concentrated chemical plants. The biggest one here in the United States is in I think, Houston, somewhere in Texas. But the biggest one in the world is in Germany. And it's absolutely massive. It's as big as a town. And if they have to shut down, you're talking about affecting the entire manufacturing world and the supply chain. So you're creating an extremely inflationary environment because of this. So again, as we mentioned, one of the goals is to have a more dense fuel source because it keeps it lower cost. And honestly, nuclear keeps it where we don't have to worry about carbon emissions for the folks on the green side. I want to point out one more kind of silly little political situation. So the Germans clearly are making mistakes on that end, which is always surprising because you always think Germans are very efficient, very logical people, unless it's somebody with one of those little funny mustaches. Outside that, Germany's usually pretty logical people. But here in California, they've made an enormous move towards wind and solar. And they're trying to become the leader of green energy here in the United States. But it's already having an enormous impact on California citizens. Just from back 2011, they're looking at their costs have risen 5 times more than the typical U.S. citizen. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One, it's using more solar and wind, which is more expensive. But it's also some of the silly moves that they're making as far as their energy sources. Like right now, they're going to shut down the Diablo Canyon power plant, which produces about 18,000 gigawatt hours per year. Right now, 2 of the other big well-known power plants that you probably heard of is the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam. But both of those together only produce half the energy that the Diablo Canyon power plant, the nuclear plant, produces. So they're looking to shut down another nuclear plant that produces a lot of energy and want to rely on green energy. And their 2 biggest hydropower green energy, Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, are really struggling right now. As you may be aware of, that there's been more of a drought situation out in California and the whole West. What a lot of people don't realize is the entire western area, when you talk California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, they're all operating for water sources off the Colorado River. And the Colorado River is basically merely just snow runoff from the Rocky Mountains. So you've had less snow the past few years in the Rockies, so you've had less runoff. So Colorado River is at lower levels than normal, which means that not only is that going to be an issue for water supply for these folks out west, but it's also going to reduce the amount of energy that these dams are going to be producing. So you've got the government looking at this situation saying, well, no, we're okay. We're all right. Let's get rid of this nuclear plant that produces 18,000 gigawatts of energy per hour, per year. And we'll go with these dams that are probably going to produce less because of lower water levels on the Colorado. So, sometimes when you have the government step in with silly ideas, and you may say, oh, it's not silly to do more solar and wind. Well, if you've been watching this, even the cursory back of the napkin calculations, you should be able to see that it kind of is. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue that, but I'm just saying that shutting down really clean, really energy dense fuel sources like nuclear is just not a very smart thing. So how do you make money from this as an investor? Well, I think that, you could make some money in nuclear over the longer term here. Nuclear energy really had a good year in 21 and started through this year, but it's pulled back quite a bit. It got way ahead of itself and it's pulled back for the most part about half. So is it a good time to get in? I don't know. I'm not sure. Nobody knows. But if you're thinking about energy is essential to the economy and we need cheap energy, and really we also are trying to achieve lower carbon emissions, I don't know how you can look at this and not say that nuclear is going to make up a bigger part of it. At some point, the folks clamoring for strictly solar and strictly wind power are going to come to the realization that it can't happen. And it may be through the ballot box. The tactics that's been undertaken by the Biden administration this year, it's probably going to result in some losses at the polls. And that will prompt them to start to look at their beliefs and really start to dig deeper into the data to make sure that, okay, we still are committed to green energy, but we need to make sure that we're not going to sandbag the economy with incredibly high costs. So these are things you can do. Now, obviously, if you want to go to individual stocks, there's quite a few stocks. I kind of put out some of the more famous ones here. But you can invest in the actual uranium itself. There's a new Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. And all it does is it holds physical uranium. It stores it. It's got storage places in Canada, US, and I think England. But you could go the other route and do a more diversified holding if you're not somebody who can dig in and figure out, stock valuations and which companies are positioning themselves for the best growth. If you want to just kind of get access to the entire sector, there's some really good ETFs out there. The Global X and the North Shore Uranium actually holds not just mining companies, but it holds the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust as well. So you've got access to the actual commodity plus the companies that are mining for it. And another kind of interesting approach you could take is to invest in a royalty company. So the Uranium Royalty Company, what a royalty company essentially does is it acts like a bank. It loans money to mining companies so that they can go out and do mining. But rather than getting repaid like a bank, where they just get interest and repayment of the principal, they get royalties on the actual underlying commodity that's produced. Now, if you're thinking of investing in nuclear, you have to be aware of something. It's an extremely volatile investment. Commodities in general are always volatile, but a sector like uranium is even more volatile. This is what you can see the past year-to-date volatility of the VanEck Uranium Nuclear Energy ETF, and then this is the Global X Uranium ETF. Lots and lots of volatile price movements. So if you're going to do this, either you need to be very active in your management of these holdings, or you just have to know that I feel that uranium and nuclear is the future of energy, and I'm going to invest in it, and I'm going to buy and hold it, and I'll ignore these short-term movements, feeling that the long term is going to provide me a nice return on my investments. The other thing you always want to be sure of, this, obviously I'm not giving financial advice here. You need to do your own research, but the other thing is don't put too much of your portfolio into this. You never want to over-concentrate in any one sector. If you're going above 5% of your portfolio into anything nuclear, you really need to think twice. You don't want to really do that. That's just some general advice, but every person's different. Maybe you only want to put 1% into it, which would still add some incremental growth, maybe beyond what the market's going to do if, in fact, nuclear becomes a bigger energy source here in the U.S. and around the world. Hey, if you're a real risk taker, maybe you go up to 10%. But, once you're getting to that 5%, you really need to start thinking about it as an investor. And finally, the lawyers say hi. Always want to make sure this is just information I'm putting out there. I'm trying to make sure that everything I'm putting out here is accurate. But I can not contest that it is. And of course, if you're going to make any kind of financial moves, you want to have some financial assistance, financial planner, some good research. Don't take this as financial advice in any way. But if we are looking to satisfy both energy groups in this United States, ones that want green energy, low carbon output, and we also are looking for energy dense, low cost fuel sources, I just don't see how at some point we don't use nuclear as the largest source of energy here in the United States and probably around the world.